The Kreth Dominion had been moving through the galaxy like a wave of destruction that nothing could stop. And in the past 3 cycles, they had conquered 47 different star systems without breaking a sweat. And now they stood at the edge of another target that seemed even easier than all the others combined, because their intelligence reports showed that this civilization was barely out of its infancy when it came to space travel and military technology. So Commander Zixthor stood, tall on the bridge of his flagship called the Consuming Darkness, and he looked at the holographic display floating in front of him with a sense of satisfaction that came from knowing victory was already assured before the first shot was even fired. The target was a yellow star system with a single inhabited planet that the natives called Earth, and the species living there called themselves humans. And according to all the data the Kreth had gathered, these humans had only been traveling between stars for about 200 years, which was practically nothing, compared to the thousands of years most spacefaring civilizations had under their belts, and their military was scattered across a dozen small colonies with outdated weapons and shields that would crumble under even moderate Kreth firepower. So Zixthor expected this conquest to be over in a matter of hours, and then his fleet could move on to the next target on their long list of worlds to conquer. 300 warships made up the Kreth Armada, and each one was a masterpiece of destruction built over centuries of warfare and loaded with plasma cannons that could melt through solid metal like butter and railguns that fired projectiles fast, enough to punch holes through small moons, and missile batteries that carried enough explosive power to level entire cities in a single strike. So the idea that a primitive species like humanity could stand against such overwhelming force seemed laughable to every Kreth warrior on every ship in the fleet. Captain Danny Morrison received the emergency alert while he was stationed near the Mars orbital platform aboard his frigate called the EDF Valiant, and when the long-range sensors picked up the incoming fleet, his heart sank like a stone because the numbers on his screen told a story of absolute doom, since 300 enemy warships were heading straight for Earth, and the entire Earth Defense Force had maybe 50 ships that could actually fight, and most of those were just patrol cruisers and frigates that were designed for chasing pirates and smugglers, rather than fighting an actual military invasion force. Danny immediately sent out an emergency broadcast to every human colony and military installation within range. And the message was simple and terrifying at the same time, because it said that the Kreth Dominion was coming, and humanity had exactly 72 hours to prepare for what might be the last battle their species would ever fight. And when that message went out across all channels, people everywhere stopped what they were doing and looked up at the sky with fear in their hearts, because they all understood what it meant when an alien armada showed up at your doorstep. On Earth itself, Admiral Patricia Hayes called together the Emergency War Council, and the room filled with politicians and generals who all had different ideas about what should be done, and the politicians wanted to try negotiating with the aliens, because surely there was some kind of diplomatic solution that could avoid bloodshed, while the generals wanted to fight with everything they had, because surrendering without resistance was not something humans did easily. But Patricia knew the hard truth, which was that they would probably try both approaches and fail at both, because the Kreth did not negotiate with species they considered inferior, and humanity did not have the military strength to win a straight fight against 300 warships. But there was one option left, and it was a secret that had been buried in classified military files for 20 years, and hidden away from public knowledge, because it was too dangerous and too expensive and too experimental to reveal unless there was absolutely no other choice. And now that moment had arrived, so Patricia made a decision that would change everything, and she accessed the restricted files about something called the Dreadnought Project. Deep inside the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, there was a hollowed-out planetoid that had been converted into a secret construction facility, and inside that facility sat a ship that was unlike anything humanity had ever built before, and it was called the EDFS Retribution. And it was not just a warship but a statement of human determination and stubbornness, because for 2 decades the best engineers and scientists and military strategists from every human colony had poured their knowledge and resources and dreams into creating something that the galaxy had never seen before. The problem was that the Retribution was not ready for combat because the weapon systems had never been tested in actual battle conditions, and the crew assigned to operate it had only done training simulations rather than real missions, and the ship itself had never even left its construction berth to fly in open space, so putting it into battle now was like asking a baby to run a marathon. But Patricia Hayes did not have the luxury of waiting for perfect conditions So she made the call and contacted the man chosen to command the retribution. Captain Jake Murphy stood looking through the observation window of the construction platform, and he stared at the massive vessel that floated in front of him. And it was beautiful in a terrifying way, because the ship was 5 kilometers long, from bow to stern and covered in reinforced armor that could probably withstand a direct hit from a small asteroid, and bristling with weapon ports that housed electromagnetic railguns powerful enough to punch through a moon and experimental fusion, reactors that could generate enough power to light up an entire city. And at its core was a prototype quantum displacement drive that could theoretically move the ship faster than anything else in known space. He turned to look at Commander Lisa Bennett, who was his executive officer, and he saw the same mixture of fear and determination in her eyes that he felt in his own heart, because they both knew what was being asked of them, and it was impossible, but they were going to try anyway, because that was what humans did when faced with extinction. Patricia Hayes gave them an order that seemed designed to break them, and she said they had 72 hours to make the retribution operational and combat ready, or humanity would face total annihilation. And when Jake heard those words, he wanted to laugh or cry, or maybe both, because 72 hours was not nearly enough time to finish what should have taken another 6 months of careful testing and calibration, but he simply nodded and accepted the mission, because what else could he do? Jake looked at Lisa and said 72 hours, and she repeated it back to him like a promise or maybe a prayer. And then they both turned to watch as engineering crews swarmed over the retribution like ants crawling across a steel giant, and everyone was racing against a clock that refused to slow down no matter how desperately humanity needed more time. The EDFS retribution emerged from the darkness of space like some ancient god of war, returning from a long slumber, and the human ships that had been fighting desperately for their survival suddenly scattered and cleared a path as the Dreadnought entered the battlefield, and its hull reflected the light of Earth's sun, making it gleam like polished silver, and weapon ports dotted its surface like scales on a dragon, and painted on its bow in letters 50 meters high was its name and designation, for all to see. On the bridge of the consuming darkness, the Kreth crew stared at their view screen in stunned silence, because the laughter had died, and the mockery had ceased, and before them floated something they had not anticipated, and something their intelligence had completely missed, and it was a human warship that dwarfed anything in their entire fleet. Grax found his voice first and said that what they were seeing was impossible, because the humans did not have the technology to build something that massive, and their civilization was too young and too primitive to create such a vessel. But the evidence was right there in front of them, and impossible or not, the ship was real. Zixthor was already running calculations in his head, because size meant power, and power meant weapons, and weapons meant danger. And he quickly gave orders for his fleet to form Battle Formation Delta and concentrate all fire on that vessel, because he wanted it destroyed before it could demonstrate whatever capabilities it possessed. 100 Kreth warships turned their weapons toward the retribution, and targeting systems locked on, and power cells charged, and every warrior on every ship prepared to unleash devastation. On the human Dreadnought's bridge, alarms screamed as targeting locks illuminated the tactical display, and Lisa Bennett called out the count in a voice that tried to stay calm, but had an edge of tension running through it, and she said, 103 enemy ships were locking weapons, and they were detecting multiple plasma cannons and railguns and missile batteries all preparing to fire. Jake Murphy sat in the captain's chair with his hands gripping the armrests hard enough to leave marks, and this was the moment that everything came down to, and everything humanity had built, and everything they had hoped for, would be proven or destroyed in the next few seconds. He gave the order to raise shields and charge all weapons, and prepare to demonstrate why you should never threaten a human homeworld. The Kreth fired first, because they always fired first, and a barrage of plasma bolts and kinetic projectiles crossed the void in a brilliant display of destructive power, and it was enough firepower to vaporize a small moon or turn an asteroid into dust, and the bridge crew of the Retribution braced for impact and waited to see if their ship would survive. The weapons struck the Dreadnought's shields in a cascade of brilliant light that lit up space like a newborn star, and energy readings spiked to dangerous levels, and hull stress monitors shrieked warnings, and everyone held their breath, and then slowly the light faded away. The Retribution emerged from the firestorm completely unscathed and floating there, as if nothing had happened. Lisa Bennett checked her readings twice before she believed what she was seeing, and reported that shields were at 87%, and hull integrity was at 100%, and they had taken everything the Kreth had thrown at them and barely felt it. A cheer erupted from the bridge crew, but Jake silenced it with a raised hand, because taking a hit was one thing, but hitting back was what mattered now. He gave the order to target the enemy flagship with main railguns at full power and told his weapons officer to fire when ready. Deep in the heart of the Retribution, magnetic coils charged with enough electricity to power entire cities, and 3 massive tungsten slugs that each weighed several tons were loaded and accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, and the ship shuddered as the railguns discharged and released their payload with devastating force. The slugs crossed the distance in seconds, and the consuming darkness attempted to evade, but something that large could not turn quickly enough, and the first slug punched through the shields as if they were made of paper, and the second and third followed right behind it and tore through armor plating and deep into the ship's interior. Explosions rippled across the Kreth flagship as secondary systems detonated, and entire sections of the hull blew outward and vented atmosphere and bodies into the cold vacuum of space, and the mighty vessel that was the pride of the Dominion fleet listed to one side, trailing debris and flames. Sixthor picked himself up from the deck where the impact had thrown him, and half his bridge crew was dead or injured, and sparks rained down from damaged consoles, and the main view screen flickered with static and smoke filled the air. He managed to croak out an order for a damage report, and the response made his blood run cold because engineering sections 4 through 9 were completely destroyed, and shield generators were offline and main weapons were offline, and they had lost 40% of their combat capability from a single salvo. A single salvo, and those words hammered into Zixthor's mind like nails being driven into wood, because the humans had built a ship that could cripple his flagship with one attack, and how many more shots could it fire, and how many more ships could it destroy? He opened a channel to the fleet and gave orders for all vessels to execute attack pattern Omega, and surround that ship and destroy it with everything they had, because if they used their numbers properly, they could overwhelm even the mightiest ship. The Kreth Armada responded, and hundreds of ships moved to envelop the Retribution in a sphere of firepower, because they would attack from every angle at once, and even the strongest shields could not withstand that kind of concentrated assault. Jake Murphy watched the enemy fleet's movements with grim satisfaction, because they were doing exactly what he had hoped they would do, and he told Lisa to activate the point defense grid. Across the Retribution's hull, thousands of automated turrets emerged from concealed ports, and each one was equipped with rapid-fire lasers that had been designed for one purpose, which was shooting down incoming projectiles, and it was technology borrowed from Earth's early missile defense systems, but scaled up and enhanced far beyond anything that had existed before. The Kreth fired, and missiles and plasma bolts and railgun slugs converged on the Retribution from 360 degrees, in a storm of destruction that should have obliterated anything in its path. The point defense grid came alive and created a web of laser fire that intercepted and destroyed 90% of the incoming weapons before they even reached the shields, and the remaining 10% hammered against the energy barriers, but the Retribution's generators held firm. And then it was humanity's turn to fire back. The Dreadnought was not designed for fighting single targets because it was designed for fleet destruction, and secondary weapons batteries opened fire, and each one was powerful enough to be the main gun on a human frigate, and missiles launched in swarms carrying fusion warheads and fighter craft, deployed from launch bays piloted by men and women who had trained their entire lives for this moment. The Kreth Armada began to die in flames and explosions. Ships exploded under the concentrated firepower, and hulls were torn open by railgun slugs moving at speeds that defied imagination, and fusion warheads detonated in brilliant flowers of nuclear fire. And in the first 5 minutes of engagement, the Retribution destroyed 23 enemy vessels and crippled a dozen more. Danny Morrison watched from the battered EDF Valiant and could barely believe what he was seeing, because the humans were actually winning, and they were taking apart the Kreth fleet piece by piece. Kevin Torres was laughing with tears streaming down his face and reported new orders from Admiral Hayes, saying that all remaining fleet vessels should form up on the Retribution and press the attack. Danny wiped his own eyes and straightened in his chair and gave the order to take his ship into the fray, because they had aliens to kill and humanity to save. The surviving human ships rallied behind their champion and charged into battle with Renewed courage and their weapons added to the storm of fire that the Retribution had unleashed. Zixthor watched his fleet crumble and knew the truth he had been avoiding, which was that they had underestimated humanity in the worst possible way, and the species they had dismissed as primitives had built something magnificent and terrible, and now it was tearing his armada apart. He had two choices, and neither was good, but one was better than the other, and it was something he had never done in 30 years of military conquest, but he gave the order to withdraw and retreat. The Kreth Armada arrived at the edge of the solar system exactly when they said they would, and Commander Zixthor watched with amusement as the primitive human ships formed defensive lines near their homeworld because he could see 53 vessels arranged in what they probably thought was an impressive battle formation. But compared to his 300 warships, it looked like a group of children trying to stop a tidal wave with their bare hands. Zixthor opened a communication channel, and his translator converted his words into the human language, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who had done this dozens of times before, and he said that the inhabitants of Earth would surrender their system and swear loyalty to the Dominion, or they would be completely destroyed, and he gave them 1 hour to decide their fate as if he was being generous by offering them any choice at all. On the bridge of the EDF Valiant, Captain Danny Morrison listened to the ultimatum, and he clenched his fists so hard that his knuckles turned white, and around him his crew worked in tense silence as they checked weapon systems and shield generators, because they all knew how this would end, but they were not going to surrender without putting up a fight, even if that fight was hopeless. Admiral Patricia Hayes responded from Earth Defense Command, and her voice was steady and strong, even though inside she was terrified because she knew what was about to happen, and she told Commander Zixthor that humanity did not bow to tyrants, and they rejected his demands, and if he wanted their system he would have to take it by force. And then she closed the channel before he could respond. The bridge of the consuming darkness erupted in laughter, because the Kreth warriors found human defiance hilarious, and one warrior named Sub-Commander Grax actually wiped tears from his compound eyes and said that these pitiful creatures with their tiny ships actually thought they could resist the might of the Dominion, and it was the funniest thing he had heard in years. Zixthor allowed himself a thin smile, and then he gave the order that everyone had been expecting, and he told his fleet to destroy the human military vessels but to leave the planet intact for now, because he wanted the humans to watch their protectors die before the Kreth took their world and stripped it of resources. The Kreth Armada surged forward with weapons charging and engines burning bright against the darkness of space, and they moved like a swarm of metal locusts descending on a field of grain. Danny Morrison gave the order that his crew had been dreading, and he told all ships to engage at will and make the aliens pay for every meter of space they took, and then the Battle of Earth began in earnest. The human ships fought with a ferocity that actually surprised the Kreth, because these primitives used tactics that were unconventional and even reckless, and sometimes frigates would deliberately ram into larger Kreth cruisers and detonate their reactors to take the enemy ships with them, and fighters would fly directly into weapon fire to get close enough for a single killing shot, and every human vessel fought as if surrender was a concept they had never learned, or maybe refused to accept. But courage could not overcome numbers, and that was just a mathematical fact that no amount of bravery could change. And within the first hour, humanity had lost 20 ships, and the EDF Valiant took a direct hit from a plasma cannon that tore through 3 decks and vented atmosphere into space, and Danny Morrison ordered emergency repairs, while his tactical officer named Lieutenant Kevin Torres tried desperately to find any weakness in the enemy formation. Kevin reported that the Kreth shields were regenerating faster than human weapons could damage them, and they were not winning this fight, and probably could not win it no matter how hard they tried. But Danny already knew that because every captain in the fleet knew it, but they had to buy time for evacuation shuttles to escape Earth, and time for the colonies to prepare, and time for anything that might change the tide of battle. In the asteroid belt, Jake Murphy was running out of that precious commodity called time, because the retribution systems were coming online but much too slowly, and the main weapons were operational but the targeting systems kept glitching and throwing errors, and the engines could move the ship, but the quantum drive was still not synchronized properly, and they had maybe 60% combat effectiveness, and even that was an optimistic estimate. Lisa Bennett appeared at his shoulder holding a tablet that showed casualty reports from the battle near Earth, and she said they had to move now, because the fleet was being slaughtered, and every minute they delayed, meant more human ships were dying. Jake wanted to wait because he wanted the ship to be perfect and ready and tested, but perfection was a luxury that humanity no longer possessed, and sometimes you had to go to war with what you had rather than what you wished you had. He gave the order to sound general quarters and told all hands to get to battle stations, and then he sent a message to Admiral Hayes, saying that the Retribution was going active and moving to engage the enemy. Throughout the massive ship alarms blared and crew members ran to their posts and engineers performed final checks on systems that should have had months more testing, and in the hangar bays, fighter pilots climbed into cockpits with hands that shook from adrenaline and fear and determination all mixed together. The Retribution's fusion reactors roared to full power, and the lights of the construction platform flickered and died as the Dreadnought drew every available watt of energy from the facility. And then, for the first time in its existence, the EDFS Retribution moved forward under its own power. The movement was not graceful or smooth, but it was movement, and the ship cleared the asteroid field and turned its bow toward Earth, and toward the battle, and toward the alien armada that thought humanity was already defeated. On his view screen, Commander Zixthor watched another human frigate explode under concentrated fire from his ships, and the battle was going exactly as planned, and he estimated that in another hour or maybe two, the human resistance would be completely broken and then the real work of conquest could begin. His sensor officer suddenly spoke up with confusion in his voice and said they were detecting a new contact coming from the asteroid belt, and it had a large mass signature and was moving at high velocity toward the battle. Zixthor glanced at the tactical display, without much interest because it was probably just a human cargo hauler trying to escape the system, and he told his officer to ignore it and focus on destroying the military vessels instead. But the sensor officer was persistent and insisted that the mass signature was enormous and was reading as larger than the consuming darkness itself, and that got Zixthor's attention. He pulled up the sensor data himself and felt confusion wash over him because the readings made no sense at all and the object was massive and easily 3 times the size of his flagship, and it was accelerating directly toward the battle at a speed that should not be possible for something that large. Zixthor ordered a full scan because he needed to know what this thing was, and the answer came back seconds later, and for the first time in his long military career, he felt something he had not experienced in decades, and that feeling was doubt mixed with the first tiny seed of fear. The humans had been hiding something and now it was coming to kill them all. A full year had passed since the Battle of Earth, and the Sol system had been transformed into an armed fortress that bristled with weapons and defenses at every strategic point, and Jake Murphy stood on the observation deck of the newly completed orbital shipyard watching construction crews work on not 1 but 5 more dreadnoughts, because the success of the Retribution had convinced the Earth Defense Force to invest everything into building more capital ships. Lisa Bennett, who had been promoted to full commander, approached with a data pad and told him that the Defiance had just completed its shakedown cruise, and Captain Rodriguez reported all systems were operating at full efficiency. Jake said that was good news because it meant they now had 3 operational dreadnoughts with 2 more launching in the next 4 months, and he gestured toward Earth hanging below them like a blue marble and asked if she thought it would be enough. Lisa followed his gaze and said that intelligence suggested the Kreth were assembling a fleet of over 3,000 ships, which was 3 times what they brought last time, and she did the math out loud, saying 5 dreadnoughts against 3,000 enemy vessels, and then she said they were going to need a miracle. Jake pointed out that they had needed a miracle last time too, and they were still here. Lisa said that last time they had surprise on their side, but this time the Kreth knew exactly what they were facing. Jake could not argue with that, because the past year had been spent not just building ships but preparing for an enemy that would not make the same mistakes twice, and new weapons had been developed and tactics had been refined, and alliances had been formed with other species who feared Kreth expansion. But the question remained whether it would be enough. Deep in space, the Kreth Armada gathered like a storm preparing to break, and 3,000 warships assembled with each one crewed by warriors who were hungry for vengeance, and war leader Kixlar stood on the bridge of his command vessel called the Eternal Dominion, and he studied the holographic display of his fleet with deep satisfaction. He announced to his officers that this time there would be no mistakes, because they had studied the recordings of the human dreadnought and understood its capabilities, and their new shielding technology would resist human railguns, and their enhanced plasma cannons would burn through human defenses, and their overwhelming numbers would crush any resistance. He pointed to the tactical display and said the humans had built more dreadnoughts according to their scouts, and perhaps 5 or maybe 6 total, but it did not matter because the Kreeth had 500 ships for every human dreadnought, and they would destroy the ships first and then destroy the planet and then erase humanity from the galaxy completely. The bridge crew roared their approval with mandibles clicking in anticipation of the coming slaughter. On Earth, Admiral Patricia Hayes received the confirmation she had been dreading because long-range sensors had detected the Kreeth fleet's departure from their staging area, and they would arrive in the Sol system in exactly 72 hours. 72 hours again, and history was repeating itself, but this time the stakes were even higher than before. She activated the emergency broadcast system and sent the alert to every human ship and station and colony and said that the Kreeth were coming and all military personnel should report to stations, and all civilians should proceed to evacuation centers, and this was not a drill because humanity's second test had arrived. Jake Murphy received the alert on the bridge of the Retribution, and around him his crew moved with practiced efficiency as they prepared the ship for combat, and they had drilled for this moment countless times over the past year, and now it was real. The communications officer announced they were receiving a transmission from War Leader Kixlar of the Kreeth Dominion. Jake straightened in his chair and told the officer to put it through. The view screen flickered to life, showing the alien commander, and Kixlar was larger than Zixthor had been, with darker carapace and heavier armor, and when he spoke his voice carried absolute confidence. Kixlar said that the human vessel Retribution had impressed the Kreeth during the first encounter, and they had built an impressive weapon and used it well, and for this he would offer humanity one final chance to surrender and yield their system to the Dominion, and their species would be allowed to serve the Kreeth. But if they refused, then every last human in the galaxy would be exterminated. Jake let the silence stretch for a long moment before responding, and he said that humanity did not bow to tyrants and the Kreeth were welcome to try taking the system, but they would find that humans had been very busy since the last visit. Kixlar's mandibles clicked in amusement, and he said the humans had built more ships and the Kreeth had detected 5 dreadnoughts, but 5 against 3,000 meant the human mathematics was very poor. Jake admitted that maybe humans were not very good at math, but they were extremely good at fighting, and he told the war leader to try not to bring too many ships because humanity would hate to make the wreckage field too crowded. He cut the transmission before Kixlar could respond. Lisa whistled softly and said that was either very brave or very stupid. Jake agreed it was probably both, but they needed the Kreeth angry, because angry commanders made mistakes. The 72 hours passed in a blur of final preparations, and fighter squadrons ran final drills, and Marines checked their weapons for the 100th time, and engineering crews performed last-minute system checks, and across the entire Sol system humanity held its breath and waited. When the Kreeth Armada finally arrived, it was like watching a metal storm materialize from nothing, because 3,000 ships filled the void like a plague of locusts, and they formed up in a massive sphere that completely surrounded the human defensive positions. Jake Murphy looked at the tactical display and felt his stomach tighten, because even seeing it with his own eyes, the sheer scale of the enemy fleet was overwhelming. He opened a fleet-wide channel and said that today they fought not just for Earth, but for every human in the galaxy, and the enemy thought they could crush humanity with numbers. But it was time to show them that humans were not so easily broken, and he ordered all ships to advance to engagement range. The 5 human dreadnoughts moved forward in tight formation with their escorts fanning out beside them, and behind them every serviceable human warship followed, and against 3,000 enemy vessels, humanity fielded barely 200 ships, but every single one was crewed by people who knew exactly what they were fighting for. Kixlar watched the humans advance and felt a moment of respect for their courage before he gave the order to attack. The Kreeth Armada surged forward, and the Second Battle of Earth began. The 5 human dreadnoughts formed a defensive pentagon, with overlapping fields of fire that created a killing zone. No enemy ship could survive, and when Kreeth vessels entered range, they were torn apart by railgun fire and missile barrages and laser batteries, and the smaller human ships darted between, the dreadnoughts using them as mobile fortresses while striking at vulnerable targets. But the Kreeth had learned, and their new shields absorbed more damage, and their formations were tighter and more disciplined. and they used their numerical advantage to attack from multiple vectors, simultaneously forcing the human fleet to spread their fire thin. The Retribution shuddered under repeated impacts, and Jake watched shield strength drop to 70%, then 60, then 50, and damage reports poured in from across the fleet, and the Defiance had lost a main engine and a cruiser had been destroyed with all hands, and fighter squadrons were taking terrible casualties. They were losing, and Jake knew it. He opened a channel to Admiral Hayes and requested permission to execute Contingency Plan Delta. There was a long pause because Plan Delta was desperate and possibly suicidal, but it might be their only chance. Patricia finally gave permission and told him Godspeed. Jake turned to Lisa and ordered her to execute Plan Delta. The 5 dreadnoughts suddenly broke formation, and their quantum drives engaged simultaneously, and in a flash of twisted space they vanished from the battlefield, leaving the rest of the human fleet alone on the Eternal Dominion. Kixlar watched the dreadnoughts disappear and felt triumph surge through him because they had fled and abandoned their own people. But Jake Murphy had not fled because he had repositioned. The 5 dreadnoughts re-emerged from quantum space at the heart of the Kreth fleet in a pentagon formation surrounding the Eternal Dominion itself. Kixlar had 3 seconds to realize his mistake before all 5 dreadnoughts opened fire at point-blank range. The Eternal Dominion died in a storm of railgun fire and nuclear warheads and simply ceased to exist, and was vaporized along with its entire command staff. Without their commander and without their flagship, the Kreth fleet dissolved into chaos and the Pentagon formation became a meat grinder, destroying every enemy ship within range. The surviving human ships rallied and pressed their attack with renewed fury. The battle raged for 18 more hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt, and by the time the last Kreth ship either surrendered or fled, humanity had won the most unlikely victory in galactic history, and proven once and for all that they would not go quietly into extinction. The order to withdraw spread through the Kreth Armada like a shockwave that hit every ship at once, and vessels that had been pressing their attack suddenly broke off with engines flaring as they attempted to disengage and escape. But some ships were too damaged to move quickly, and others were caught by human fighters or missile salvos before they could reach safe distance, and what had been an organized assault became a panicked rout as the mighty Kreth fleet turned tail and ran. Jake Murphy watched the enemy retreat on his tactical display, and every instinct in his body told him to pursue them and press the advantage and destroy as many alien ships as possible while they were vulnerable. But he was also very aware of his ship's limitations because the Retribution had performed beyond all expectations, but stress fractures were appearing in the hull, and 3 of the main railguns were offline due to overheating, and shield generators were cycling at dangerously high temperatures. He called for a status report, and Lisa Bennett consulted her displays with a tight expression on her face and told him that shields were down to 42% and hull integrity was holding at 91%. But they had micro-fractures in sections 7 and 12 and 18, and main weapons were available, but they needed to let the railguns cool down or risk permanent damage, and fighter squadrons were requesting permission to return for rearm and refuel. Jake nodded slowly because they had won this engagement. But the Retribution was not invincible, and if they pushed too hard, they might discover the ship's breaking point at the worst possible moment. He gave the order to recall all fighters and cease pursuit and let the aliens run. And then he opened a channel to the entire fleet and told all vessels to reform defensive positions around Earth, and congratulated everyone because they had just saved humanity. The bridge crew erupted in cheers as exhaustion and relief mixed together into something that resembled joy, and they had done the impossible, because a single human dreadnought and a handful of support ships had turned back an armada that had conquered dozens of civilizations. But Jake Murphy did not celebrate because he knew what the Kreth would do next, and they would be back with more ships and better preparation. On the consuming darkness, Commander Zixthor surveyed what remained of his once mighty fleet, and the numbers told a story of complete disaster because 217 ships had entered the Sol system, but only 143 were now limping away, and many of them were severely damaged, and 64 vessels had been completely destroyed with their crews either dead or captured by the humans. It was the worst military disaster in the entire history of the Kreth Dominion, and Zixthor knew his career was probably over. Grax approached him cautiously, because the sub-commander's carapace was cracked and leaking blue blood, and he suggested they should contact Dominion High Command and inform them about the human Dreadnought. Zixthor's eyes narrowed because telling High Command meant admitting they had been defeated by primitives, and that a species they had dismissed as insignificant had built a weapon that destroyed a third of their invasion fleet, and admissions like that often led to executions. Grax insisted that they needed to tell the truth, because if the humans had one such ship, they might have more, and the Dominion needed to prepare for future encounters. Zixthor knew his subordinate was right, even though pride and fear warred within him because the Dominion did not tolerate failure, especially not failure on this catastrophic scale. But if he did not report it, then other Kreth commanders might attack humanity without proper warning, and the losses would be even worse. He finally gave the order to send the report and tell High Command everything about what had happened, and about how the humans were not the easy prey everyone thought they were. Back on Earth, celebrations were erupting in every city as news of the victory spread at the speed of light through all the human colonies, and people danced in the streets, and strangers embraced each other, and champagne flowed freely, and for one brief shining moment, humanity was completely united in triumph. Admiral Patricia Hayes allowed herself a small smile as she watched the celebrations on her monitor, but then she turned to the more sobering reports that were piling up on her desk, and they contained casualty lists and damage assessments and resource calculations that told a less cheerful story. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over, and she knew it. She opened a secure channel to the Retribution, which was now in high orbit above Earth, and Jake Murphy's face appeared on her screen, looking as tired as she felt. Patricia congratulated him and told him that he and his crew had just become the most famous humans in the galaxy. Jake gave a tired smile and asked what their orders were. Patricia told him that for now he should get his ship repaired and his crew rested, but she needed him to understand something important, and she said that they had hurt the Kreth today and hurt them very badly, but the Kreth Dominion controlled a significant portion of the galaxy, and what they had faced was just one fleet, and the Dominion had dozens more, and now humanity had made them angry. Jake said that she thought they would come back. Patricia said she knew they would come back, and next time they would come prepared specifically for the Retribution, because the element of surprise was gone. Jake nodded slowly and said that humanity would use the time wisely, and they would repair and train and be ready, and if the Kreth wanted round 2, then humans would give them a fight they would never forget. 3 months passed, and deep in Kreth-controlled space, the Dominion High Command convened an emergency council, and the report from Zixthor had sent shockwaves through their entire civilization, because a human ship had done what no enemy vessel had accomplished in centuries, and it had defeated a full Kreth armada in open combat. War leader Kixlar studied the tactical recordings with cold, calculating eyes, and he watched the human Dreadnought emerge from the asteroid field, and he watched it shrug off the concentrated fire of 100 ships like it was nothing, and he watched it systematically destroy some of the finest vessels in the entire Kreth fleet. He finally declared that this situation could not stand, because the humans had issued a challenge whether they realized it or not, and if the Dominion allowed this defeat to go unanswered, then every species in the galaxy would think they could resist Kreth expansion. Another council member asked what he proposed they do. Kixlar's mandibles clicked together in what might have been a smile, and he said they would gather a proper fleet, and not 300 ships but 3,000 ships, and they would bring enough firepower to reduce the entire human system to dust and ashes, and they would demonstrate to the entire galaxy what happens to species that dare to defy the Kreth Dominion. The council murmured in agreement because it would take time to assemble such a massive force, and perhaps a year or more would be needed. But when they returned to the Sol system, there would be no laughter, and no underestimation, and no mercy. Only total war until humanity was wiped from existence.